In 1971, Nixon launched the war on drugs. Since then, it's cost for taxpayers on average $100 billion per year. It produces estimated gang revenue of $320 billion a year. And globally, 1 in 5 people are in prison for drug-related incidences. What have been some of the biggest failures of the war on drugs in the last 50 years?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing to look at is what is the aim of the war on drugs? Having such high levels of enforcement, what is the objective here? So the objective here is to have a drug-free society. It's to have a society in which no one uses drugs and in turn have no drug-related harms. That's kind of the main philosophy behind it. And if you look at what's happened over time since Nixon famously came out with the kind of the war on drugs approach, none of those objectives have been achieved. So today, more people use drugs than ever in history. We have more drug-related deaths than ever in history. The criminal drug trade is bigger than it's ever been, and there's not really kind of an end in sight here in terms of reducing all of these harms. And so I think a lot of people in the policy world, in academia, activists, but also people who use drugs on the ground are now really calling for a change in approach, looking at kind of more novel alternatives like decriminalization and the regulation of drugs and these sorts of things. But yeah, just purely from kind of the cost of life, the number of people who have died from prohibitionist drug policies is really, really staggering. And if you look at kind of the reasons behind that, there's a really interesting concept called the iron law of prohibition, which I'm not sure if listeners have heard of this, but it's basically it's a very well proven concept where the more you try and restrict the global drug trade, the more potent drugs become. And so yeah, that's another thing that we can talk about moving forward. But I find that fascinating, and yeah, it's just really crazy to me how despite all of this kind of data and knowledge that is out in the public sphere, governments are still refusing to change their approach.
Yeah, the crazy thing with prohibition is there's always going to be demand for drugs, whether we like it or not, and whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing. But the current way we've set it up is it's gangs who supply drugs, and it's not drugs aren't being produced in safe pharmaceutical environments. What do you say of the main failures of prohibition?
Yeah, definitely. So that's also another one of the big lies about prohibition is that we can get to a society where no one uses drugs, and that's just completely ridiculous. Throughout human society, throughout the ages, people have always used drugs. I mean, there's really interesting research that dates back to thousands of years where you can see that kind of early humans were using kind of psychedelic plants and these sorts of things. So people have always used drugs, and even so, people will always use drugs. I think it's just kind of even ingrained into our human nature and wanting to kind of experience kind of a different level of cognition, these sorts of things. And yeah, just trying to restrict that has really just caused a lot more harm than good. And even looking at kind of the arbitrary regulation of drugs, how it's not done based on harm, it's done really based on kind of the problematic racial history of how these drugs became enforced. If drugs were regulated now based on harm, alcohol and tobacco would be the first ones to get regulated. So it's just really backwards.
What is the racial history that exists with drug prohibition?
Yeah, definitely. So actually, the prohibition of drugs is a fairly recent phenomenon. It was only in the kind of the late 1800s that in North America there started to be a ban on opium because it was Chinese migrant workers who came over from Asia to help build the railways, these sorts of things. And opium was their drug of choice. Alcohol was kind of the drug of choice of kind of the white populations there, and so they put a ban on opium. And immediately, what that did is it created a heroin market. And even now today, we can see that the ban of heroin has kind of produced more kind of synthetic opioids, which are even more dangerous. But that's just one example. I think then you can carry on into the early 1900s when there started to be bans on marijuana marijuana in the southern US, because that's what Mexican migrants were using. But the most famous kind of racial racial motivation for drug prohibition was around crack cocaine and powdered cocaine. So kind of at the time, 70s and 80s, when Nixon came into power, crack cocaine and powdered cocaine were being used pretty much at the same levels. But the thing is that powdered cocaine was being used by kind of the white middle class in the US, and crack cocaine was being used by Black and Hispanic communities. And so we can see literally in the legislation, in the law that was passed at the time, there was a 1 to 100 discrepancy in the prison sentence times for trafficking. So you would get 5 years in prison for trafficking 5 grams of crack cocaine versus 5 years in prison for 500 grams of powdered cocaine. And so the consequences of that were huge in terms of filling up the prison populations in the US. And yeah, no, just really interesting. You kind of all of these different drugs that have been sorry, again, you can look at psilocybin, mushrooms, and these sorts of things. Acid, MDMA, that was associated with more of the kind of the hippie community during the time of the Vietnam War, who were pushing back against government policy around then. So they said, we can't just go out and arrest hippies. We need something that will actually target them. And so people at the time in those communities were using psychedelics and drugs. And so it was a tool as a way of kind of getting to these communities in a legitimized kind of way.
Yes, it's crazy. I'm sure we'll get onto psychedelics and psilocybin a bit later on. But I was reading there's even just subtle differences, subtle forms of racism that has been inserted into the war on drugs. For example, I think in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Americans, they started to blame the Mexicans. It was the Mexican migrants who, contributed to the Great Depression. And they started calling cannabis marijuana instead of cannabis. We use the Spanish word instead of the English word because we like to alienate it and, I guess create this image in our head that it's a terrible thing. What